It was March 2nd in the year 1776 when the siege of Boston occurred. In advance of the Continental Army's occupation of Dorchester Heights, Massachusetts, General George Washington orders American artillery forces to begin bombarding Boston from their positions at Lechmere Point, northwest of the city center. After 2 straight days of bombardment, American Brigadier General John Thomas slipped 2,000 troops, cannons, and artillery into position just south of Boston at Dorchester Heights. The 56 cannons involved in the move were those taken at Ticonderoga, New York by Lieutenant Colonel Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen with his Green Mountain Boys, which had then been transported to Boston by Colonel of Artillery Henry Knox the previous winter. By March 5, 1776, the Continental Army had artillery troops in position around Boston, including the elevated position at Dorchester Heights overlooking the city. British General William Howe realized Boston was indefensible to the American positions and decided on March 7, 1776 to leave the city. 10 days later, on March 17, 1776, the 8-year British occupation of Boston ended when British troops evacuated the city and sailed to the safety of Halifax, Nova Scotia. The victory at Boston resulted in John Thomas's promotion to Major General. Soon after, he was assigned to replace General Richard Montgomery, who continued his eternity while fighting in action as he and Benedict Arnold attempted to take Quebec. Thomas arrived at Quebec on May 1st and soon lost his own life. Although a physician by profession, he continued his eternity of smallpox on June 2nd as the Patriots retreated up the Richelieu River from their failed siege of the city. It was March 2nd in the year 1807 that the U.S. Congress passes an act to prohibit the importation of slaves into any port or place within the jurisdiction of the U.S. from any foreign kingdom, place, or country. The first shipload of African captives to the British colonies in North America arrived at Jamestown, Virginia in August of 1619. But for most of the 17th century, European indentured servants were far more numerous in the North American British colonies than were enslaved Africans. However, after 1680, the flow of indentured servants sharply declined, leading to an explosion in the African slave trade. By the middle of the 18th century, slavery could be found in all 13 colonies and was at the core of the Southern colonies' agricultural economy. By the time of the American Revolution, the English importers alone had brought some 3 million captive Africans to the Americas. After the war, as enslaved labor was not a crucial element of the Northern economy, most Northern states passed legislation to abolish slavery. However, in the South, the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made cotton a major industry and sharply increased the need for enslaved labor. Tension arose between the North and the South as the slave or free status of new states was debated. In January of 1807, with a self-sustaining population of over 4 million enslaved people in the South, some Southern congressmen joined with the North in voting to abolish the African slave trade, an act that became effective January 1st in 1808. The widespread trade of enslaved people within the South was not prohibited, however, and children of enslaved people automatically became enslaved themselves, thus ensuring a self-sustaining population in the South. Great Britain also banned the African slave trade in 1807, but the trade of African captives to Brazil and Cuba continued until the 1860s. By 1865, some 12 million Africans had been shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, and more than 1 million of these individuals had continued their eternity for mistreatment during the voyage. In addition, an unknown number of Africans continued their eternity in wars and forced marches directly resulting from the Western Hemisphere's demand for enslaved people. It was March 2nd in the year 1917 that inhabitants of Puerto Rico become U.S. citizens and are recruited for war efforts. Barely a month before the U.S. enters World War I, President Woodrow Wilson, our nation's 28th president, signs the Jones-Shafroth Act, granting U.S. citizenship to inhabitants of Puerto Rico. Located about 1,000 miles southeast of Florida and less than half that distance from the coast of South America, Puerto Rico was ceded to the U.S. by Spain in December of 1898 as part of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish-American War. In 1900, a congressional act created a civil government for the island. The first governor under this act, Charles H. Allen, was appointed by President William McKinley, our nation's 25th president, and inaugurated that May in Puerto Rico's capital city, San Juan. On May 2nd in 1917, Wilson signed the Jones-Shafroth Act, under which Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory, and Puerto Ricans were granted statutory citizenship, meaning that citizenship was granted by an act of Congress and not by the Constitution. Thus, it was not guaranteed by the Constitution. The act also created a Bill of Rights for the territory, separated its government into executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and declared Puerto Rico's official language to be English. As citizens, Puerto Ricans could now join the U.S. Army, but few chose to do so. After Wilson signed a compulsory military service act 2 months later, however, 20,000 Puerto Ricans were eventually drafted to serve during World War I. Puerto Rican soldiers were sent to guard the Panama Canal, the important waterway in operation since 1914, which joined the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean across the Isthmus of Panama in Central America. Puerto Rican infantry regiments were also sent to the Western Front, including the 396th Infantry Regiment of Puerto Rico, created in New York City, whose members earned the nickname Harlem Hellfighters. Later, during World War II, Puerto Rico became an important military and naval base for the U.S. Army. Its economy continued to grow, aided by a hydroelectric power expansion program instituted in the 1940s. In 1951, Puerto Rican voters approved by referendum a new U.S. law granting the islanders the right to draft their own constitution. In March of 1952, Luis Muñoz Marin, Puerto Rico's governor, proclaimed Puerto Rico a freely associated U.S. Commonwealth under the new constitution. The status was made official that July. The information documented on this audio file can be verified on History.com.